So good afternoon. I'm Gabriele Ludwig. I'm Director for Environmental Policy. My title's changing, so I keep having to think about it, so sorry, guys. For those of you who know me, I've been around the Almond Board for about some 18 years on the research and on the regulatory side of things. Just want to say welcome to everybody who's here. This is one of those fun sessions where we get to talk about regulatory issues, so I appreciate you taking the time to be here. And I need glasses now in the meanwhile. So this session will explore how growers' pest management decisions in the orchard are being impacted by regulations at the state. We won't really touch about the federal level that much this time around, and at the international level, and get a perspective from a handler who has to deal with all these issues. So our speakers today, we'll start off Dr. Karen Morrison. She's the Chief Deputy Director for the Department of Pesticide Regulation and with DPR for the last 5 years. She started with the department as a science advisor and was promoted to Assistant Director of the Pesticide Programs Division and Chief Science Officer Advisor in 2019. She was appointed into her current position by Governor Newsom in October 2022, so 2 years now. Okay. And she has her PhD in chemistry from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. So we'll start off to hear about what's been going on at the California level. There's a bunch of things going on the regulatory side and things that the state's sort of working towards, and Karen will try and give us a sense of all of that that's going on.
Thank you, Gabriele, for the introduction and for all of you for being here. As Gabriele mentioned, there is a lot happening with the department, and so appreciate a chance to talk about both some big picture conversations we're having around pest management and what that looks like in California, as well as some practical what's coming down the pipe, what regulations are going to be in effect as of January next month, and also what are we planning toward. Checking on slides. Oh, do I have to? Oh, I advance it myself. Okay, wonderful. Power in my hands to move the slides myself. So I just want to start by talking about a little bit about who we are, what we do. And so our mission is to protect people and the environment by fostering sustainable pest management and regulating pesticides, with a vision of a California where pest management is safe, effective, and sustainable for everyone. And this touches on a lot of different work within the department, everything from our initial registration and scientific review of pesticide products before they can even be sold or used in the state. It covers our monitoring activities through pesticide use, illness, environmental impacts, as well as our work on enforcement in partnership with the county ag commissioners. So we touch on a lot of different elements around pesticide use and management in the state. One of the things that is really driving our work as we're moving forward is sustainable pest management. I know our director, Julie Henderson, was here last year to talk about this initiative, and want to continue to state publicly my appreciation for Gabriele and many others who took part in the lengthy process to develop this. Gabriele asked me to not spend a lot of time on this because our director was here last year, but I wanted to talk about it briefly because it is grounding so much of the directional work the department is doing and is really part of our vocabulary and vision for where we're headed as a department in the coming years. And so this is really rooted in thinking about, why do we do pest management in the first place? Why is it important as a way both for supporting agriculture and thinking about growing healthy food, being able to ship that to its various destinations, as well as thinking about the role of pest management as a critical public health tool, as a way of maintaining public infrastructure to make sure that we can go and go about our lives within the state. We also recognize, though, that the way we manage pests can also impact public health, individual health, and the environment, depending on how that is performed. And so wanting to think about how we address both of those issues at the same time, and recognizing that the way we are managing pests is changing. Climate change, different growing times, different seasonality, thinking about changing efficacy of pesticide products are all really driving system-wide conversations about how do we think about what tools are available for pest management and how all of that comes together. And so we brought together a group of folks to talk about developing a system-wide approach to accelerate the adoption of sustainable pest management in both agricultural and non-urban settings. And so after 2 years, this group, which we convened along with the California Environmental Protection Agency and the California Department of Food and Agriculture, released the roadmap in January of this year. And this sits on my desk and I reference it regularly as a part of thinking about our initiatives and really thinking about how do we do this work in a systematic way of really thinking about both the tools that we need, the alternatives that are available, and the impacts of that use. And want to emphasize that this is really building on existing IPM practices. This is a question I get a lot of how does this fit together? And I view this really as how do we build on the core biology of IPM and build on top of that additional consideration of impacts to human health, the environment, equity, economic impacts, and do it in a thoughtful, public, transparent manner as we move forward. So within the roadmap, I want to just highlight a couple of things. The first is the 5 keystone actions in the roadmap. There's a lot of depth within this, but these were sort of the top 5 takeaways on what would need to be done in this area relative to thinking about sustainable pest management into the future. And that includes prioritizing prevention, keeping the pests out of the state, the field, the house, the structure, as the first and best way to manage pests. Second is to coordinate state-level leadership. How are we having consistent conversations about different statewide initiatives? How does that fit into climate efforts, natural working lands? How does that fit in terms of thinking about regional approaches to pest management? I know that this industry has done a lot of work thinking about that in different ways. Third is investing in building SPM knowledge. How do we work with the UC system, other researchers and practitioners on what information is available for lower risk pest management practices and making sure that we're doing the research to identify that and also doing the training to make sure that folks are aware of what innovation is out there and what the benefits could be from that work. Fourth is a very DPR focused priority around looking at our registration process for new alternatives for pesticides to make sure that those are available to have tools in the toolbox. And finally, that our work is best done if we have data to support the work that we're doing. And so recommendations around enhancing monitoring and data collection to support that work. This was sort of all of the collective actions were then taken together and said, what might be possible by 2050 if all of the recommendations are in place? And I say it like this as a what is possible if those activities are in place, because that was the thought process in developing these 2050 goals. And so looking at by 2050, California has eliminated the use of priority pesticide products, asterisks, we're going to come back to this in the next slide, by transitioning to sustainable pest management practices. And also by 2050, the SPM or sustainable pest management will be the de facto pest management system in California, in ag, in urban and industrial settings. So I want to talk a little bit more about priority pesticides. Again, this is an FAQ that we hear in a lot of places. This does not mean banning all pesticides by 2050. I want to really clearly state that because I hear that. That is not what this is. What this is looking at first, what are our high-risk pesticides? Those pesticides that have the hazard label on them, that are known to have particular significant impacts to human health or the environment. And then taking those and further asking the question, are there alternatives available? Are they feasible? What is in development? How do we think about those trade-offs? What critical uses are these products being used for? And use that as a way to guide if we have a highly hazardous product, if there are plenty of alternatives that are feasible, that are in use, should that still be used in the state? And that's what's envisioned within the priority pesticides, is pulling those, both the question of risk as well as the question of availability of alternatives. And to have this discussion as a part of a public process under an advisory committee to be able to provide recommendations to the department and gather input and information. And then also, if we answer the question, there are no alternatives, to think about, okay, what steps can we do to help support research and development to build on work that's already happening, or to be able to help signal the need for additional investment by public or private entities as a part of that. So what does this mean? So the roadmap came out in January, and as I mentioned, this is driving a lot of our work and thinking about what do we want to see in the system, who are we partnering with, and how does it guide our work? And so we've been doing a lot of conversations with folks to gather additional feedback, to talk about practical impacts, to talk about needs. Where do we want to think about investment opportunities and how that can come together? And so out of those conversations, we're already starting work on the recommendations, looking at developing and hiring additional positions to help with our registration process, to have more alternatives available, as well as to hire a position specifically to take on leadership around sustainable pest management and to be in those coordinating conversations. We're also in the process of developing a new strategic plan for the department. Where are we headed? How do we do that in a transparent way? What metrics do we want to be able to include to be able to help guide that work moving forward? We're also starting to get into this question of what does it mean to evaluate a feasible alternative? And so received funding as a part of last year's budget to do a fumigant alternative study. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, as well as continuing to invest in research into alternatives and what that could look like. So first, I want to dig in a little bit more to our strategic plan. We last updated our strategic plan in 2018. We've done a lot of work in the last 5 years, and I'm really proud of our teams and what they've been able to do as a part of that. But it's time to take a look at what's coming in the next 5 years. And so we've identified 4 overarching goals as a part of the draft plan that was released earlier this fall, to increase access to safe, effective, sustainable pest management. That's looking at both availability of tools, availability of research, and how we can play a role as a part of that work. Second is to track, evaluate, and enforce safe pesticide use. Our regulations are only as good as they are when they're being followed. And we know that there's a lot of work that's being done in that area, and there are places for continuing education enforcement and making sure that we're holding everyone accountable to the same standards within the state. Also wanting to think about the question of data availability. Again, how do we understand the system and how can that inform good policies moving forward? Third is fostering engagement, collaboration, and transparency, really wanting to make sure that we're out having conversations with people who both use pesticides and are impacted by the use of pesticides, and doing that throughout the state in a transparent way. And then finally, continuing to promote excellence and innovation as a part of the work that we do. We just closed a comment period on this last month, so we're working through comments and are looking toward updating next year for the next 5 years. I mentioned the fumigant alternatives study as a way to look a little bit more about how we're thinking about alternatives, and using this, I think, as a model for trying out what questions do we ask, what kind of research do we need to gather. And so we are working with agency partners and various stakeholder groups to develop, or we have worked to develop, a scope of work for the study. Really want to appreciate this industry, Gabriele and others, for providing feedback on what questions we're answering. I think to reflect that there is a lot of work that's been done around thinking about alternatives to fumigants, particularly for pre-plant for tree and vine, following the phase out of methyl bromide. And so wanting to be able to reflect and incorporate that, as well as look at questions beyond just fumigant use in agriculture. And this is something we're having more and more conversations about, of the use of not just fumigants, but pesticides in non-agricultural settings, and making sure that we're maintaining and encouraging similar levels of professionalism, safety, appropriateness of use in those settings as well. So this study is going to be looking through a independent research entity to look at what are past and current practices around the use of fumigants, not only in California, but globally, to be able to ask questions and to inform policies for the state moving forward. And so we're in the contracting process, and so we're hoping to be able to kick this off early next year. We also continue to fund innovative research, as well as the application of new research practices within the state. We received increased one-time funding as a part of the budget a couple of years ago, and so have seen significant increases both in the number as well as the scale of grant projects that we're able to fund. And so want to just highlight a couple of these, in particular looking at soil fumigation. So the first is a grant that we awarded a couple of years ago, looking at fungicides and grafting as a way to look at a broader IPM system for seedless watermelons without fumigants. And again, crop specific in that case, but thinking about similar strategies for how we can look at different ways that are not just pesticides, but are broader IPM strategies. Second is a grant from a couple of years ago looking at soil fumigants in fresh market carrot production. And so looking at rotations between carrots and tomatoes as a way to, again, minimize use of fumigants. And then finally, considering alternatives to both soil fumigants and diallyl sulfide for management of white rot in allium crops to look at impacts in those spaces as well. So that's what we're doing around SPM, how we're thinking about moving forward. And as we build into our work on that, the rest of our regulatory work is still ongoing. And so we're thinking about how that fits with the broader direction of the department and how we're moving forward. So I want to talk about some changes that are coming, and there's a lot more details about these on our website. Happy to answer questions, but wanted to kind of run through what's coming Jan 1. So the first is new regulations for 1,3-dichloropropene or T-lone for the use as a pre-plant soil fumigant. This has been a long time coming and started out of some initial presentations that we were doing in 2018, 2019, following some higher readings that we were seeing as a part of our environmental monitoring program. And out of those conversations, as well as other work, really identified that there was an opportunity here to think about what practices are being used in California, where can we better credit them as a part of our regulatory program, and how can we work with industry in identifying what those opportunities are. And so we partnered with several of the county ag commissioners and worked closely with both the almond and walnut industry to look at how do we credit different practices for field fumigation, and to be able to collect data to say, can we reflect that appropriately within our regulatory system? And so did a number of pilot projects in 2020 and 2021, looking at the feasibility of fumigation methods that were comparable to TIF tarping. We recognize that TIF tarps are super effective and are also very expensive. And so the return on investment for those can be complicated, especially for crops where it takes several years to start collecting a harvest. And so we're able to, out of those pilot projects, identify lower emission methods to be able to move forward with as a part of our broader regulatory scheme. And so out of this, we have created a number of new fumigation methods to be able to credit as a part of application, as well as layering on considerations of what the use of 1,3-D means for emissions relative to those who may be living near where a field is. And so have new regulations coming out reflecting both those new methods as well as some requirements associated by method with setbacks to occupied structures based on acreage and application rate. This is really similar to what we have for other field fumigants within the state, and so we're looking to kind of model similar types of requirements, but based specifically on the data and risks from 1,3-D. So that is coming into effect Jan 1 next month. We are also continuing to work on conversations in partnership with other state agencies around considering impacts to occupational bystanders. So we'll probably be back here next year talking a little bit more about that work as it continues. The next regulation I want to talk about is our neonics regulation. So this was a regulation we adopted in April of this year that becomes effective again Jan 1 of next year, looking at protecting pollinator health, and specifically looking at the active ingredients clothianidin, dinotefuran, imidacloprid, and thiamethoxam for chronic risks to bees. This is, I think, a really amazing regulation for me to talk about because this industry, I think, really led the way in proactively thinking about what are impacts to pollinators as being critical for the crop that you all produce and taking a lot of really early proactive action relative to the use of many of these active ingredients to avoid impacts as a part of your work. And so what we're looking to do is, as these regulations become effective, to look crop by crop, what are the risks to pollinators, and to be able to appropriately account for that as a part of practices throughout the state. The final regulation I want to mention that's going into effect next month is our certification and training regulation and requirements. This is part of a broader federal effort to continue to raise the bar around certification and training requirements for licensed applicators and pest control advisors across the United States. California is in a great place in that we have already done a lot of proactive work in requirements that were coming down federally, and some of the requirements were still more stringent than what we had in California. And so this has been a long effort both by the department in partnership with US EPA as well as with a number of other states to update and align regulations across all 50 states to these requirements. Specifically, and I think of importance for this group, and in the theme of fumigants, is that we are now creating standalone categories relative to soil fumigation in order to continue to use those products within the state. This is part of making sure that we can maintain minimum training requirements. As I mentioned, these changes are going into effect on January 1st. We know there's been a lot of work transitioning and getting ready for these changes, and we've been in close conversation with a number of different industry groups around how are those playing out, what does that look like, what are the impacts, and so we're continuing to have conversations about that. Really appreciate folks who have been working with us as we've been expanding testing centers, making sure that we have training materials out so that people can be aware of the requirements and be in compliance with the rules on this. Also want to talk about what's coming for the department. So one of the initiatives the department's working on for the last couple of years is thinking about how do we provide additional transparency to what's happening around pesticide use in the state. And so we have been working to develop a statewide information system to provide the public with transparent access to information prior to the application of agricultural restricted material pesticides, specifically those pesticides that require a permit from the Ag Commissioner prior to use. This has been a lengthy development for the department, formal conversations starting in 2021, but certainly some informal conversations before then. We had 5 pilot projects in 2022 to test out elements of this and are currently running a beta test in Tulare County around what this could look like. We also noticed regulatory changes in order to work toward this system last month. That is currently open for public comment. That runs through January 12th, and we have a series of hearings next Wednesday, December 13th in Clovis, California, December 14th in believe Ventura, possibly Oxnard, Ventura, thank you. Ventura on the 14th, and then a virtual hearing the following Tuesday to be able to receive verbal comment and then also written comment through January 12th. So looking forward, there's a lot of changes happening, and that we recognize that there's a lot to do around that and a lot of conversations to be had in terms of understanding feedback, impact, and being able to incorporate that as a part of our work. And so we're really looking forward to moving toward a vision of California where pest management is safe, effective, and sustainable for everyone, taking into account how we can protect people and the environment as a part of that process, but doing that in partnership with all of you and with many others throughout the state in order to inform the work that we have moving forward. So we're holding questions until a little bit later on, so I will conclude there. Thank you all so much for the time, and I look forward to hearing from the other speakers.
So thank you, Karen, and I don't think I exaggerated when I said there's a lot coming your way. Just a reminder for those of you, tomorrow in the last session, there's actually a training program for for the brown card, for those of you who need to be updating on that. So just to let you know, that's actually part of the conference, so stick around for that. Next up is Alinne Oliveira. She's Deputy Director for Global Access at Bryant, Christie, Inc., which is a consulting company based in Seattle and actually here in Sacramento. She focuses on MRL, or maximum residual limit, issues for pesticides, as well as other trade policy issues. Prior to joining BCI, she worked with several agricultural organizations in Brazil, her home country, on agricultural policy issues and trade issues. And she has a master's from the School of Foreign Service from Georgetown University. So she'll now shifting to outside of United States pesticide issues.
Thank you, Gabriele, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. So as Gabriele mentioned, in addition to you having to comply with all the US and California regulations on your production, you also, when you export, of course, you have to keep in mind that you need to keep compliant with the regulations of your destination markets as well. So that's what I'm here to talk to you about today, about the pesticide MRLs in some of the key markets. As Gabriele mentioned, I'm Alinne Oliveira. I'm Deputy Director at Bryant Christie. Let me see, keep passing. There we go. And Bryant Christie, we're a consulting firm. We're based in Seattle and Sacramento. We are a consulting firm specialized in international agricultural issues. My main focus is pesticide MRL regulations around the world. So quickly, today we're just going to review why MRLs are important, what are the main challenges, and then we're going to review the MRL policies in some of the key markets and how we can mitigate some of these trade risks. But before I start, I always like to revise a little bit the definition of what a maximum residue level is, which is the highest level of a pesticide residues that is legally allowed in or non-feed when pesticides are applied according to the label. And the reason why I like to visit this is because when you export to, let's say, Japan, the European Union, you don't necessarily have to comply with their registration, right? What they're regulating is the pesticide residue on your product. So in the United States and in California, you have to comply with the registration, whether that product is approved for use in California, and you have to follow the label. But when you export your product, what the markets, the international countries, the other countries are looking at, they're looking at the residue level on your product. And that's why there is the MRL standard. And that MRL standard varies, unfortunately, between the countries, which pose some key challenges. So why are MRLs important? As I mentioned, MRLs can vary between your destination markets. There is an increased focus on food safety, and that includes MRLs. Of course, it's not specific to MRLs. So in the last 2 decades, we've seen many countries around the world, they are establishing new food safety regulations, and then they're establishing their own MRL systems. We do have an international standard, which is the Codex MRLs. Many countries used to defer to the Codex MRLs, but now, as more countries are establishing their own systems, they may use these international standards whenever they're establishing their own systems. It's still relevant, it's still important, but then you have one more country, one more system that you have to monitor and understand and navigate. And if you export to these countries and you need to comply with their MRLs, with these new systems, of course, there's more monitoring, more enforcement, and some violations can be, some markets have very strict violation policy and they may deny entry of our product. They sometimes may even have the products destroyed and not allow you to re-export or bring back to the United States their products. So potentially could be a huge loss for the exporter. So to talk about some of the challenges, I think I'll just give some examples. I think it might be easier. So let's say that you have your California almonds, you applied pesticide X, and you want to export to Brazil. But then your product that applied pesticide X that you want to export to Brazil, in Brazil you don't have an MRL established, so technically you're expected to have 0 residues from that pesticide. So some markets, not all countries produce almonds, so sometimes you have missing MRLs. You don't have an MRL, and could be because that the market doesn't have a system for you to request and import MRL, or because they don't produce. For many reasons, they may not have an MRL established. But regardless of the reason, not having an MRL established is definitely one of the main challenges. The second challenge is that sometimes they do have MRLs established, but they're more restrictive than the US MRL. Or let's say, you know, in Japan, in the US, it's 1 parts per million for one pesticide, and then in Japan it's 0.9, China 0.5, India 0.01, and then again, Brazil 0. So how do you navigate all of those different levels? So this is very challenging for exporters. And finally, another challenge is changing MRLs. Once they're established, they're not set for life. You know, they do change, and some markets, they do change often. And I can tell you, like we on our team, so Bryant, Christie, we support the work of ABC monitoring MRL changes around the world. And usually we review between 3,000 and 3,500 MRL changes per year. And I would guess around 150 to 200 are relevant for almonds. So it is huge work. It takes a lot of resources just to track what MRLs are changing. So keeping with my example here, let's say the European Union had an MRL established at 1 part per million, harmonized with the United States for that pesticide X. But then there was a review of the MRL, and then the MRL was proposed just 0.01, or the MRL was deleted. So when you made your decisions, your crop protection decisions in the 2022 season, for example, that 1 ppm MRL was in place. But by the time you were exporting that product in 2023, what happened? That MRL changed. So that is a huge problem as well, a key challenge for exporters. So now I will review the policy in some key markets. Of course, I don't have a lot of time to review in detail, so I'm just going to highlight some of their main characteristics. So let me start with Mexico. So I know Mexico is an important market. Mexico, they do have an established national list of MRLs. But for Mexico, it is understood that they accept the trade partners' MRLs, in this case, the US MRLs, when you're exporting there. But I say this with a little caveat. I have not seen that written anywhere. I know that in practice that has been accepted and established. They will accept EU MRLs as well, Codex MRLs, but I haven't seen that written down. So for Mexico, they will accept US MRLs, and they do not have a default MRL, meaning if no MRL is established, they don't have a 0.01 default tolerance, for example. Next is China. So China is one of those markets that I mentioned that just have their own recently, like in the last 2 decades, recently created MRL list. Their MRL list is limited, but it is expanding. There are many MRLs missing in China, and they don't have a default MRL in place like a 0.01. They do not automatically defer to Codex, but they have been incorporating Codex MRLs into their national lists. And unfortunately, China is one of those countries that you cannot apply for an import MRL. So if you need an MRL there, you either work through the Codex system or you have to go through trials and the registration to get an MRL in China. The good news with China is that they have limited monitoring. I have not heard of many MRL violations or challenges in the Chinese market. Second is the European Union, which is I spend a lot of time in. So the European Union, they have their own European Union-wide list. So if you're exporting to Spain or Germany or France, it is one MRL that applies. They do have a default tolerance, meaning that if they have no MRL established, a 0.01 parts per million will apply. They do accept and adopt Codex MRLs if when the Codex MRL is established, they have no concerns, like they issue no reservation with it. But they do have a system as well that you can apply for an import MRL in case one is needed. One of the main challenges in the European Union, as I'm sure most of you know, is their pesticide use policy that has been very restrictive. Their current framework for pesticide use within the European Union is very restrictive. So what we've been observing in the past few years is that once a pesticide is no longer approved for use in the European Union, then that MRL might be deleted, and then the default tolerance or sometimes the limit of quantification will apply. And again, of course, in the European Union, you also have a lot of private standards that a lot of exporters have to comply as well. United Kingdom, so the EU, the UK left the EU, and they adopted all EU MRLs as of December 31st, 2020. They are slowly building their own system to do MRL reviews, pesticide registrations, and so forth. So starting in 2024, it was a 3-year transition. We expect to start seeing more MRL reviews and more MRL divergence between the UK and EU markets. Because of the agreement, the separation, the Brexit, so you have what is actually called the Great Britain MRLs. So England, Scotland, and Wales, they follow the Great Britain MRLs. Northern Ireland continues to follow EU MRLs for border concerns, of course. So when exporting to Great Britain, you have to comply with the Great Britain MRLs. So just couple of comments on the EU pesticide policy. As you know, as I just mentioned, they have a very restrictive pesticide policy currently in place. But in 2020, there was the European Green Deal and then the Farm to Fork and all these proposals to further restrict their pesticide policy. The objective was to reduce by 50% the use and risk of pesticides by 2030, increase organic production. They have had a lot of objectives. But frankly, since I prepared this presentation 2 weeks ago till now, the European Parliament rejected the sustainable use of pesticide regulation, which was the legislative venue that they were using to implement the Farm to Fork objectives. So the European Parliament rejected the proposal. Next year is election year in the European Union as well. So it is unlikely that this proposal is going to move forward between now and the elections by next summer. I just want to be cautious. Does not mean that this is going to go away, but it just means that for now, that model and that proposal that was discussed, it has not moved on. And another, on good news as well, for glyphosate. Glyphosate, there has been a huge discussion in the European Union regarding the approval, the safety of glyphosate for use. There was a huge group of reviewers, 4 European member states reviewed all of the scientific studies for glyphosate. European Food Safety Authority reviewed as well. And November 28th, the European Commission renewed the approval of glyphosate for another 10 years. There was huge concern whether the European Union would follow the science or whether they would follow political pressure, political social pressure. So it was welcome news that the European Union decided to implement the decision to renew glyphosate according to the scientific advisors. And so with that, we do not expect that there will be any MRL changes for glyphosate based on the approval of glyphosate. So to finalize, so everything that happens in the European Union, it can potentially have what we call the Brussels effect. Do I still have time? Okay. What we call the Brussels effect. So everything that happens in the European Union in terms of regulation is also very important, especially for markets in Africa, the Middle East, some places in Latin America, because the European Union is such an important market. So proposals such as the Farm to Fork or the Mirror Clause or the application of the European standards to imported food was quite concerning, because even, let's say, to those that do not export to the European Union, you export to Central America or Africa or some other, markets that also export to Europe, they could adopt the EU policies just because it makes it easier in case that they have to export to the European Union. So it was a huge concern, it remains a huge concern to see how the European Union will apply and will work with its trade partners to implement some of its visions of sustainable policies. So to finalize, after all this good news, how do you deal with mitigating MRL's trade risks? So this is one area that the Almond Board of California is very strong, and we support their work, which is to know their current MRLs in export markets. So the Almond Board of California has the database where you can access the MRLs that are established in your key markets. It's important, of course, for you to talk to your handlers to know the key markets, monitor MRL changes, actively seek new or harmonized MRLs, including CXLs. So I know that Gabriele spends a lot of time doing that as well. And the engagement with US and foreign governments. So sometimes whenever there is an MRL, a proposed MRL change, there is an opportunity to engage with the USDA, Foreign Agricultural Service, FAS, in order to submit additional information on how that pesticide is used, how it is important for production. So you can provide that information, and then USDA relays that information to the foreign government. So this is something that is done and led by ABC, and we support that work. And with that, I'll take questions afterwards.
Take questions.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thanks, Alinne. And again, I don't know if Mel's in the audience. I'm often said, sing and dance, because I often talk about things that depress you all. So sorry, but just want to give you a sense of the complexity of the issues that we're facing in pest management from the regulatory side. Our next speaker is actually representing the handler, one example. Ian Darling is the Director of Sales with Monte Vista Farming Company. He's been part of Monte Vista team for about 5 years. Previously worked in the tree nut industry with a trading company. He was originally from a seventh generation family farm in Michigan. Believe it or not, Michigan has a lot of specialty crops, and the best peaches I've ever had came from Michigan. He received his BS in physics and his MS in business analytics from the Michigan State University. And again, part of the reason we brought him in is because handler is that interface between the grower who's managing the pests in the field, post-harvest management in the facility, and prepping the product and having it ready for export, and what the buyers or the exporting countries are expecting. So Ian will give us some insights from his experience.
Okay, thank you, Gabriele. Thank you to the Almond Board for having me. Is everybody having a fun time so far? I know this is, as you mentioned, it's a lot of difficulties. I'd like to say that I've got, fun, good news, but I've got issues that we've experienced to share with you guys, just to help you guys better understand what goes on. So to start, actually, I'm just going to read an email that I received this email last week from, oh yeah, yep. There we go. Okay. This is an email that I received last week, and I think it's very relevant to this conversation. So we were this from the customer. We received a customer inquiry regarding herbicides. Are the almonds tested for glyphosate? If so, what is the maximum limitation? If no testing is performed, how do you ensure that no herbicides are used? So let's think about that. How do we ensure that no herbicides are used? As a show of hands, who here uses glyphosate? Who here uses Roundup? Anybody? Okay. So when we get this question, how do we respond, right? I want you guys to think about that. I'm going to come back to that at the end of my presentation, and we'll talk about how we go forward, right? How we respond to questions like this. So the handler perspective. So again, I'm Ian Darling with Monte Vista Farming Company. We're a huller, sheller, and processor of California almonds, exporting to around 70 countries worldwide. I've been with Monte Vista for almost 5 years. When I came into the almond industry, I did have a full head of hair. After 5 years, it's all gone. So I have to say it's been, yes, fun time. Fun time for everybody in the industry. Okay, so the current situation. So we're dealing with a number of issues. Infestations, insect damage is obviously a big one this year. Serious defects, these are all issues that we're dealing with as we're trying to export and ship product to customers around the world. At the same time, the customers' food safety expectations are continuing to rise. The level of food safety that's expected from our customers every year, they want to see improvement and they're expecting more. And then in addition to that, regulations in key markets are becoming more strict. As you just mentioned, the MRLs are always changing, and so we have to make sure that we're complying with those. Otherwise, we run into issues of loads being rejected and those headaches. Again, why I no longer have hair. And so California, as the California almond industry, we have to find the balance between utilizing the tools that we have available to us in the orchard and the processing facility, while then also meeting the expectations and requirements for our customers and regulators around the world. So I'm going to give you guys 2 different examples of issues that we've experienced. So this one's related to actually in the orchard. So this was a few years ago, but we had an issue with flupyram, Luna sensation. So at the time, it was still allowed for use at hull split to manage hull rot, and so we had a grower who was doing this. We then had a customer in Italy who was testing for this MRL, found it, and came back to us with this issue. So we worked through it with that customer, but then as we move forward, and I would say this is a good success story for the industry. The industry recognized that this was an issue. We worked with the regulators and with I believe, the producer of Luna Sensation to essentially update the application guide. And so that way we're able to avoid this MRL issue in the future. So again, I think that this is a good example of where an issue is recognized and collectively as an industry we're able to solve it. Another example of an issue, this one's actually related to the processing facility. So we're also having to try to manage pests at the processing facility. One material that we have that is actually really useful for us is called, the active ingredient is dichlorvos, but the product is VAP-X or VAP-8. It's used as an ambient fumigant to control pest populations in the processing facility. So last year we had 2 rejections and a number of additional claims related to this MRL. This was, in terms of rejections, we had to come up with a solution to move that product elsewhere, and then we had to replace that product, which is certainly not cheap to do when we're having to ship product around and then send replacement loads in place of this product. So the issue with dichlorvos that then we run into is that we have customers that they're saying, well, then you can't use that product, right? You can't use that in the processing facility. Unfortunately, we don't have another solution. And as I mentioned earlier, infestation issues are a growing concern in the industry. Last year, it was a huge, huge headache, especially in the EU. So we have these tools, right, that we use to try to manage the pest populations and so that we don't run into infestation issues. But then we're running on the other side. We were between a rock and a hard place where then now customers don't want us to use these products, right? And so it's about finding this balance. And the solution, there's a number of things that go into the solution, but just ensuring that, you know, the way that it's being applied is everything is being followed correctly. Working with the almond board to continue to educate customers on it, as well as just continuing to test for it at our own facility to make sure that we aren't having issues related to this. So just in summary, I used a really big font here, so I actually can barely read this. Yeah. So I think that last line is really the main thing. So we're limited by regulations in California, and then further regulations in key markets, taking away key tools that we use to manage these issues, and taking away our ability to manage pest infestation and other issues is something that is continuing to happen. So what does the future look like as we move forward from here? So a number of things, and first of all, you know, to the growers in the room, I do want to make sure that, you know, I state processors, your handlers, the almond board are all working together to mitigate these issues, and make sure that we work with, you know, the individuals here on this panel to stay ahead of it, right? So that we can solve these issues before they become a bigger issue, right? So educating customers. So let's go back to that first email, right? How would you guys respond if somebody said, if there's no testing performed, how do you ensure that no herbicides are used? How do we use glyphosate? Anybody? Raise of hands. If nobody raises their hand, I'm just going to pick somebody in the crowd. How do we use glyphosate? Yep. Yeah. And so when we go to... Yep, absolutely. And is it applied on the almonds? It's on the orchard floor. Mm-hmm. Yep. So the solution, when we have situations like this where the customer is coming to us and saying, you know, asking these questions that, you know, on the surface, maybe we react and say, like, that sounds like a silly question. We need to educate, right? So we need to make sure that they understand that this product is being used, but it's being used in a safe way, following all guidelines, all regulations, and that it is not creating a risk for the consumers, right? So educating the customers on this, working together, making sure that customers are a part of the solution going forward as well, right? In addition to that, again, the almond board does a great job of this, but communicating with regulators, making sure that we're working with them as well, and really advocating for a risk-based approach on all of the policy making. And then lastly, finding creative solutions when we are faced with issues. Sometimes we have to think outside the box to solve some of these problems that arise. So in summary, again, customer expectations are continuing to increase, and regulations are continuing to increase, placing farmers and processors in a difficult position. So going forward, we need to make sure that we continue to educate customers on this, on what we're doing, all the good things that we're doing here in California in the almond industry, bringing in customers to be a part of the solution, working with regulators, and then lastly, working to find creative solutions when necessary. So thank you guys for your time.
So now it's time for question and answers. I have a request for those managing the lights. I cannot see the audience because the lights are too bright, so we can turn the lights up in the room. And then meanwhile, I ask a question just for Karen. You mentioned a special certificate or licensing now for pre-plant fumigation. What about post-harvest fumigations? Is there a special licensing for that, or has that already been in place, or is that a detail?
I have to check.
Okay.
I don't remember off the top of my head. In general, the fumigant handling and use is being pulled into separate categories. I don't remember which are in which groups.
Okay.
So
just for those of you on the handling side, that means both for the stockpiling and for in the facilities, make sure that you've got the right licenses coming January 1 for your post-harvest fumigations. So with that, there's either the microphone here, or if there are questions, and again, I realize there's a lot of complicated questions. Go ahead, issues, go ahead.
Regarding the issue you just talked about, my understanding is under QAL, you need commodity certification, and you do have to get the new updated license for commodity certification as well. The problem we have, though, is this new criteria came to us relatively late in the calendar year, and I submitted my application and my fee, and bought my study guide, and it's been almost 45 days since I did that, and they haven't come back to me yet and said, okay, you can take your tests on these days, these locations, and the calendar year's running out. So I can see a train wreck here where the end of the year's gonna come and I can't even take the test, and I won't be able to do any commodity fumigation. So maybe you don't know the answer, maybe you do, but if there's a way you could get back to us with an 800 number or a website so we could try to get expedited testing, we really appreciate it.
I appreciate the question, and I think where it's coming from is I want to make sure all my paperwork's in order, right? That I'm doing the work, we're making sure to be in compliance with it. It's a lot of changes for a lot of people. So we are looking into what our options are around that. I don't have anything to share today, unfortunately, but we are looking into options for it. And so, happy to share out through ABC kind of contact information for our licensing program. And I'm hoping that we've been in conversation with this industry and with others about what options can we look at, knowing that Jan 1 is coming up very, very soon and wanting to make sure folks have time to be able to take the exams.
What I'd add to that is on the post-harvest side, you don't have seasonality. That's kind of year-round. And with the stockpiling and with the quality issues, it's incredibly critical to be able to do the post-harvest fumigant. So that's not something, I'm just going to be upfront with you, that's not something we would like to see any time lag in the ability to do that, because that will really affect the quality of the nuts that are there. Okay, so just to add to what you were saying. Any other questions, given the complexity of the issues, or comments?
I have one.
Yeah.
In regards to the 5-year plan for DPR, one of the bullet points had something to the effect of we're looking at more data. Is this data going to be provided from the county level to DPR? And is the discussion that you're looking at pre-spring, pre-application data available to you, or is the PUR that you generate not good enough in a little more detail? If you go into detail.
Yeah, it's a great question, and appreciate that bullet point is pretty broad in terms of thinking about a lot of data. I want to start by saying that our agricultural pesticide use reporting is the best in the nation, possibly best in the world. We use that, we communicate with a lot of people about what's there, and feel really good about 98% of what's there, right? There's always places that we could think about improving what reporting looks like. For that particular bullet point, I think what we are more focused on is talking about what are we doing around environmental monitoring? What does that mean in terms of our air monitoring? We have a long history of monitoring in surface water, groundwater, and air monitoring stations, but thinking about what does pesticide monitoring look like in wildlife? What does it look like in wildlands? How can we think about being able to make sure that we're able to understand and articulate impacts in those areas? We've also talked a lot about pesticide use in non-agricultural settings. We collect data as a part of sales for both agricultural and non-agricultural uses, but once it moves into use, the reporting looks very different in that sector. And so there are places where I think that's going to be sort of an insurmountable challenge. I don't know that we're looking for individual, how much raid did you use in your house last year kind of reporting. That's not going to happen. That's not realistic. But trying to understand to be able to better articulate and talk about what those impacts look like is something that we've been in conversation with for a lot of years. I think it's less focused about the ag pesticide use data collection than it is about other areas of data to inform policies.
Other questions? Good.
Hi, Karen. I'm with the Bottom Control, one of the paramount companies, and my question is in regards to the improvement of the registration process. And so it's great to hear that that's on the document and in the plan, but I was wondering if you could expand a little bit because we've seen, products like ours and pheromones that fit in this roadmap and really adopting, sit on the desk for an incredibly long time and kind of get stuck. So I'm really excited to hear what the improvements are going to be, what we can look forward to, and how that's going to maybe move along past that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think one of it is we're seeing that new products coming in are increasingly complex compared to products going through. And so some of it is staffing and training for our own staff about what is coming through, what to review, as well as overall staffing levels to be able to review and process those in an expedient way. I will say a number of our stations, we have 2 people who work in a given station, and it's slightly scary to me. I've had people report back on tracking numbers, and they can tell when a person takes a 2-week vacation based on what the impacts are to look at that. So the impact of that means is that when we are on pace, we can maintain pace, and if we start to slip, catching back up is much more challenging. And so we've been doing a lot of work to look at what is the highest and best value of our review in California relative to registration review. We're subject to federal requirements, but also additional and separate California state requirements. And so how do we focus on those elements relative to our process? How do we look at California specific conditions? The fact that we have 400 different crops often grown in close proximity to each other. And so how do we take that into account? So I think it's a combination of both process improvements as well as thinking about staffing levels and what's appropriate. We're certainly in broader conversations about whether or not there should be expedited processes for reviews of certain products. I say it like that because it's a bit of a controversial topic and one that we're still kind of in open conversations about. How does that look? How is that similar or dissimilar from federal registration systems? And what could we think about within the state?
Good.
Could you just generally address the whole topic of regulation of biopesticides? This seems to be chemical that we talked about throughout this last hour. And read the trade publications, and biopesticides are the next chapter. Are you developing protocols, or is it a focus? Is there a focus group? Things like that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's. I want to start by talking about what I define a biopesticide as, and also then kind of the range of what's included in that, right? So if we think about the broadest definition of a biopesticide, a pesticide that has some kind of natural origin, there's a whole spectrum of different kinds of products, how we think about risk associated with that. And so, what we've talked about within the team is where are we distinguishing our regulations based on the original origin of a product versus where are we looking at sort of the absolute risk of that product and what's involved? And where are risks from pheromones, for example, different than risks from a conventional fumigant, for example? I know those are maybe not great in comparison to each other, but kind of how we...
Fermentation product, so keep it in the biopesticide paths. So the risks from a fermentation product versus a pheromone.
And so how do we take that into account and balance that with not creating 300 different subsystems to be able to review? There's a lot of innovation happening in this area that's really, really exciting. And so we did a workshop earlier this year to talk about what are some of the new emerging technologies that are coming out there? How do they fit into our regulatory structure? And frankly, this is an open conversation both in California and federally about what falls in, what falls out, where is it protecting who and what is it protecting. And so I don't have all of the answers for that. I think it's both a question of where are we kind of raising raising the bar for our own work to begin with, and then also thinking about the nuances of layering on top of that.
Let me just add to that, that this is a question at the federal level as well. I mean, they've had a biopesticide program for over 20 years, so within the OPP. But as Karen was saying, and I think I've been learning more about biopesticides recently, you know, the nature of the risks you're worrying about for an actual biological, let's say like AF36, versus a fermentation product, versus an RNAi product, versus a pheromone, versus a protein product. They function differently as pesticides, and they function differently in terms of the risks that need to be assessed. And that is that's a whole new way of thinking. So as Karen's saying, as EPA, I was on a call with EPA recently, and they're like, well, what should we prioritize? I'm like, from what I'm seeing, all of those technologies could have a role to play in almonds. So I'm not going to tell you what to prioritize. I need you to do a public process and sit down and think about what are the relevant risks and come up with the rules. What data do you need for those particular kinds of compounds? But that takes time and a process. And again, everybody wants it now and yesterday, and it's hard. As Karen was just saying, it's hard for regulatory agents at the moment to stop doing the registration process to take the time to figure out how to do it well, but then it wouldn't get stuck there for several years. So it's kind of a catch-22 situation in my mind at the federal level as well as the state level. And similarly, we now also are getting all the new technologies of drone applications or totally other ways of doing applications. Well, where does that fit into the label? So there's a lot of work going on at both the federal and the state level to try and figure out, given all the opportunities these new technologies have for precision ag, for different ways, but how, at the end of the day, there's still risks that may need to be mitigated, but they're just different kinds. Are we asking the right questions? And that's not easy. I mean, I'm not the regulator. I'm just, put input into it at times and criticize, but those are some of the questions that need to be addressed in this space in addition to just that. And then on the international space, Alinne, do you have anything to add on that?
Actually, we've been getting more and more that question of biopesticides because something might be, registered for use and exempted from a tolerance in the United States, but then once you export to the other market, they don't treat that as a biopesticide or they don't have a category of biopesticides. So if it's something that can be detected or leave some kind of residues, it takes a lot of explaining to make that product compliant. So not all markets are ready to regulate biopesticides for imported products. So it is something that's it's still dynamic, still changing, and I think a lot of countries are investing in setting up their systems as well.
Yeah. So any other questions? I'm just going to do some commentary since I tend to work a lot in this space. So one, just realized from the almond board's perspective, as you've alluded, we try and keep track of the MRL changes or what's coming down the pike at MRL changes. That will influence our research program. I just want to at least on the production side. So just realize that what we're seeing here in the regulatory world, we've been funding research on how to mitigate soil fumigation emissions as well as soil fumigation alternatives, because I've been seeing the writing on the wall for years. Do we have everything figured out? No, but I'm just saying that's just to let you know how this world then goes into the research program to make sure the growers have tools. Similarly, we're working currently on some biopesticide efficacy in addition to our traditional efficacy studies to see if there's more we can do in that space. We have data on residues. We use that to help figure out where do we need to worry and where we don't need to worry. So like the fluopyram, we saw data. We worked with the registrant and said, hey, we've got a problem here. The registrant did research and figured out that you needed to only use it basically for the bloom sprays and have given direction along that. It has not reached the label language yet, but that's changes that I will take credit for us going to the registrant and saying, hey, something's wrong here. And I give credit to the registrant for doing their homework and finding where the problem was and coming up with a solution for it. So just want to let you know that's something we are engaged with as the Almond Board, is really trying to see what's coming on down the pike and trying from the research side make sure there's alternatives. I think Tim and I need to talk some more about on the post-harvest side about that whole arena, because that's not something that we have the farm advising community and so forth in the same way as we do on the growing side. But just to let you know that this is something we take very seriously and are continuing to try and find solutions to make sure, having just listened to the navel orangeworm data for this year, we need the tools. There's no two ways about it, or we don't have a crop, or we don't have a sellable crop. So I just want to say thank you again to all of our panelists for taking the time to be here, and for you for your questions and for listening. Thank you. And